Hello, I'm Diana Thomas.
And I'm Tom Harper,
Welcome to That Wilbur Smith Show.
a podcast about the historical, geographical, natural, and human background to the world of Wilbur Smith.
Open was the word for the high veld. It stretched away, flat and empty, grass and brown grass dwindling to a distant meeting with the pale, empty sky. But the loneliness could not blunt the edge of their excitement. Each mile covered, each successive camp along the ribbon road, ground it sharper, until at last they saw the name in writing for the first time. Forlorn as a scarecrow in a ploughed land, the signpost pointed right and said, Pretoria. Pointed left and said, Witwatersrand. The Ridge of White Waters, whispered Sean. It had a ring to it, that name. A ring like 100 millions in gold.
And that's what we're going to be talking about today, the Witwatersrand and what became of it, which of course is indeed many more than 100 millions in gold, the gold fields that were found there and the city that sprang up around it of Johannesburg. Which forms the part of the action, really the heart of the action of When the Lion Feeds. So, Diana, that passage you read, that is as our hero Sean and his companion Duff come to the Witwatersrand for the first time, having come across the mountains from Natal. And what it is about that passage that that kind of grabs you?
It's the sense of the fact that A, it's still an empty country, and B, he had the name has a ring to it, but they have no specific information, as it were, to attach to that ring. It's just an idea, it's a dream, it's a promise, which I guess is true of all those great 19th century gold rushes. It's like California or what have you, which must have been, actually, a little bit earlier. It was the 49ers, weren't they? So it was 30 years earlier.
Yeah, and in fact, what's interesting, I think, in the gold rush is that in the South African gold rush, a lot of the mining engineers and also the prostitutes are American, and they've all gained their relative relevant experience from America, and then they ship over to South Africa to set up shop.
Well, and in the same way, of course, that the sort of shacks turn into San Francisco, and that will create San Francisco. So we are going to create Johannesburg. But what's also interesting is that the next thing that happens is that they see for the first time the land where the gold is meant to be. And it's just, as it says here, two ridges ran side by side, north and south, 4 miles or so apart. In the shallow valley between, they could see the flash of sun off the swamp pools that gave the hills their name. And then Sean groans, look at them, because they see tents and wagons lined along that valley, and they think, we're too late. I mean, because at that point, they have nobody has any idea of the extent of this. And what they fear is they are going to be arriving, and all the best plots would have been staked out, and all best claims would have been made, and there'll be nothing left for them. And so that's their first desperate thought is, can we get down there and get some land, some claim, something which might have gold underneath it? Because at this point, they have absolutely nothing.
Yeah, and again, this, as we'll see throughout this episode, is mirroring very much what happened, the actual historical progression of the goldfields. So people identify that there's gold there quite early on, and everyone rushes on and stakes out a claim. But because I think one of the key things geologically about the Witwatersrand is that it's not alluvial gold. It's not gold that you can just pan on the surface. And anyone with a sieve can basically try their hand. It's in hard rock that needs to be kind of blasted out and then needs to be processed in very kind of, for the time, complex machinery. And so you cannot just rock up with a pickaxe and a sieve and start going at it. You need the equipment. So although people know or suspect there's gold there and they're busy staking their claims, they can't actually work it for a very long time. And there's this great episode historically where Cecil Rhodes, who's made his fortune in diamonds, comes with his people to inspect it. And because they get the wrong end of the stick, they sort of pass up all sorts of claims that later turn out to be phenomenally rich gold-bearing plots. So yeah, there is a sense of everyone's kind of hustling for a scrap of land that they're not entirely sure what to do with.
Yes, and many of the best ones have been taken, or so it seems. But luckily, the as it turns out, the future of Johannesburg is to some extent dependent on a lady we've met in previous podcasts, the one and only Candy Rautenbach, proprietress of the local saloon, who happens to have a few claims in her possession, which she's about to sell to somebody else, until the sweet-talking, silver-tongued, posh Dufford Charliewood, Duff, Sean's best friend, sweet-talks Candy.
More than talks, I think.
First into bed, I was going to say. And I can't remember if the bed comes first or the negotiations come first.
I think they proceed more or less in tandem.
Yeah. Although it's a strange conversation to be having in flagranti. Not one I've ever had, I must say. But in any event, yes, they get hold of these claims on a basis that they get an option for $10, and they'll have to pay her 10,000 if there is gold. And then the actual drama of trying desperately to find some productive rock is very well and thrillingly explained by Wilbur Smith, as is in fact the geology. Because as you were saying, the gold is in the rock, but it's not in all the rock. It's in these reefs, in the particular strands of rock or levels of rock, which themselves are kind of waving up and down, coming closer to the surface, plunging down to earth, turning left and right. They're it's basically strands of spaghetti, golden spaghetti.
Yeah.
And you have to put your fork in and hope that you hit one of the golden strands. And of course, this being fiction, after many an adventure, and when all their money is running out, and when there's no hope left, Duff and Sean hit gold and hit it big. And they then, as you rightly say, they have to get hold of this machinery, and it takes weeks, I think like 8 weeks or something, to get to them. And then it's all rusty when it arrives, because the rock has to be crushed. And you can just imagine these old steam-powered thumping things going all day long. And all they do is they crush the rock and they crush the rock. And then the rock is mixed with mercury.
Mercury, yeah.
Which must have been the most toxic process. And if there's any gold in the rock, it sticks to the mercury. And the mercury is then evaporated and condensed again to repeat the process. And with any luck, you have some gold. And at first, Sean and Duff only have tiny little scraps until they finally get great big nuggets. And the nuggets eventually turn into bars. There's a wonderful point in which they actually are standing with Sean and Duff have got a 50-pound weight of gold in a bar, and they know their fortune is made. And this and the other finds like it precipitate this extraordinary explosion, as it were, urban explosion, in which these tents and wagons turn into huts, turn into houses, turn into a town, turn into Johannesburg, which is going to become the biggest city in South Africa, and must be one, actually, well, certainly was for a very long time, one of the biggest cities in Africa as a whole, probably not so now.
Yeah, and it's I think anytime you're writing a historical novel, which this is, amongst other things, when the history is in sympathy with your characters, that's when it gets really strong. And I think what works really well in this book is that Wilbur is weaving in the story of the growth of Johannesburg, mirroring the growth of Sean's fortunes and also the changes in his character. And in a sense, because the great thing about, I think the fascinating thing is all the claims that are bought when the real life miners and speculators and prospectors are going around, what they're basically buying is they're buying farms, because all that is there is farmlands. The Boer trekkers have come across, they've declared their republic, and they've set up farms, because that's the Boer dream, is to have your kind of 5,000 acres and your herd of cattle. And so it really is a rural agricultural kind of landscape, or pastoral landscape. And into this suddenly gets plonked this city that just grows from nothing into, as you say, an enormous city. And it's sort of that change from agricultural, rural, probably quite innocent, through to this depraved. I always think of sort of Mos Eisley in Star Wars, reckless hive of scum and villainy, is sort of mirroring Sean getting richer, but also his soul becoming kind of corrupted.
What's also fascinating, just to go back a little bit, well, the two thoughts struck me as I was reading this. The first is, had the Afrikaners heard of mineral rights? All these poor dumb farmers who sold off their land for, I don't know, whatever it was per acre, only to discover the people who bought it had become multimillionaires. But in true Sean Courtney fashion, and this I think is an accurate reflection of the kind of, to use another American analogy, kind of Wild West aspect of the gold rush. It's roughnecks, and there's a lot of fighting goes on. In fact, Sean, at one point when they've run out of money, raises the finances they need to keep going by essentially being a prize fighter, by putting himself in a ring and daring all comers to beat him. And a series of spectacular fights happen. And needless to say, one of the people he fights with, in fact, the best fighter, then becomes a close friend because they sort of tested one another in battle. And there's even a kind of gunfight, because what happens is that a bunch of armed guys just come along and think, well, these people are all making a lot of money. Why don't we just take their land? And so there's a pitched battle, basically, part of which is won because they take the gigantic tank, I guess, in which all the steam is created for the rock pulping machine, and they get the Zulus to roll it down the hill at the oncoming bad guys. And there's this wonderful scene in which the Zulus are chanting out their kind of war cry as they prepare to roll successfully this great tank downhill to crush the oncoming people.
Yeah, and then I think once they've crushed them, they butcher them with their spears. So it's this like brilliant mashup of the steam age and the traditional kind of African.
The chant goes, "Where are the children of Zulu? Here. Where are the spears of Zulu? Here. How bright are the spears of Zulu? Brighter than the sun. How hungry are the spears of Zulu? Hungrier than the locusts." I'm prepared to believe that actually was the chant.
Yes.
Yes. So the point is that it started out as a lawless, and then the first thing that happens in the book, under the leadership of Sean and Duff, but I'm sure is the creation of the Diggers Committee.
Yes, which again is sort of part of the evolution. They go from a kind of complete outlaw kind of anarchic state, and then the Diggers Committee, and then that becomes a sort of junta, effectively, that's kind of running the town. And then it becomes a sort of stock market cabal, and then ultimately they sort of all join forces into a monopoly, effectively, that runs the place. And again, historically, I think it's sort of, without being in any way bogged down in the detail, it's sort of echoing the fact that as soon as Johannesburg gets going, there's a constant tension between the people running in Johannesburg and running Johannesburg, who are what the Boers call Uitlanders, who are mainly English, but German, Americans, from all over the world who flooded in, as well as obviously black African workers who've come in to work the mines. And the Boers, because under the laws of the Transvaal Republic, only the Boers have voting rights. So political power is vested in the farmers, but actually the vast majority of the population are disenfranchised, and that's a constant sore point between them. And in fact, Johannesburg, I think for years and years to come, doesn't even have its own recognised government. It only has I think it's called like a sanitation commission. I think what we're seeing in these Witwatersrand around Johannesburg passages are two things that are very characteristic of Wilbur's writing. One of them is a small thing, but it's always fascinated me that he's quite reluctant to use real historical people, but he's quite happy to use their names. So the American that Sean Courtney fights in his boxing match, in his prize fight, who then goes on to work for him, is called Timothy Curtis. And there is actually an American mining engineer called Joseph Curtis who works with the big gold companies, the big investors, in history. So clearly, having an American engineer called Curtis as a character has appealed to Wilbur. He doesn't want to use the real person because I guess that limits him. So he's just given the name to someone different. And you see that quite often in Wilbur's writing, that he uses a name but puts it on a different but similar character, which I always thought is interesting, an interesting choice as a historical novelist. The other thing which I think we need to acknowledge is that on the detail of mining and of how this thing evolves, I think Wilbur is incredibly evocative and accurate. But I think we need to acknowledge that he's not above playing with the timeline to suit his purposes. So I think in actual fact, the gold rush starts in 1886, doesn't really get going until 1887. And it's 1888 that it's really in full swing. Whereas in this book, the last date was the Zulu War in 1879, but not that much time you understand has passed. And actually, at some point, by the time Sean's made his fortune, it's 1886. So Wilbur's playing a little bit loose with the dates, which again is something that you see throughout his books, because he's not interested in being, calendar accurate. He's got other purposes.
I mean, this is a question always that arises with, when people write historical novels or they adapt books to films, that you get the kind of pedantic thing, but that isn't exactly the truth, or that isn't exactly. Well, no, it's a fiction. I mean, that's the whole point. And for an author, the truth of fiction is, as it were, a truth of spirit. Have you caught the spirit of the time? Have you caught the spirit of the place? Are your characters believable and human, what have you? And yeah, I mean, it's not. He has no duty to follow any particular calendar. And when you're reading it, it all flows as a piece of narrative fiction. It works. That's his job, is to. I mean, I absolutely take what you're saying, and I'm sure there would have been people who would have actually, they couldn't in South Africa because they weren't allowed to read it. But had they been allowed to read it, I'm sure there'd have been indignant burghers from Johannesburg, or wherever, saying, "But you've got this all wrong. It was, da 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 da." But as a piece of fiction, he's got it completely right.
Yeah.
Interesting about your names, Lord Chelmsford is named, Chetaway is named. The Chetaway is the Zulu king.
Yeah.
And Kruger is named, unless the next thing that happens. Kruger is the president, I guess, of the Republic. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And he suddenly realizes that although, I mean, the interesting thing about Johannesburg as it's becoming is that, yes, the people there are disenfranchised. On the other hand, they have all the money. And
Yes.
very quickly, it becomes clear that Kruger is looking across and thinking, hang on a second. We can't have these unruly mob of miners and prostitutes and what have you getting extraordinarily rich, and we're not seeing any of the benefit for the state. So, as governments do, he muscles in, but not before. I mean, as I recall, I'm trying to think how much they've built by the time he really notices that it's time for him to step in.
Yeah, I mean, I think the just on the point of the money is interesting. Again, historically speaking, again, this is where Wilbur's definitely putting across the historical truth, is that in 1884, the whole income of the Boer government was £88,000. And in 1886, so the year that the gold rush is about to start, they try to raise a loan for £5,000 and they get turned down because their credit is no good, the government's. By 1895, thanks to the gold royalties plus all the other revenues that come from the kind of massive expansion, their income is £4.2 million in those times. So they're definitely onto a good thing. But Kruger's fascinating because he has this it's not even an ambivalent. He basically really dislikes the whole thing because he's almost like a Jeffersonian figure in my reading of him, who thinks that they want this kind of virtuous republic of Dutch farmers, and that there's this great quote from him where he says, "Every ounce of gold taken from the bowels of our soil will yet have to be weighed up with rivers of tears." So he's very, and he calls Johannesburg, he calls it, again, apologies to our Afrikaans listeners, Duivelstad, Devil's Town. But at the same time, his entire government and his state that he's sort of nursed into being are reliant on this gold.
Well, that's always the tension in the Calvinist mind, isn't it? There's nothing unvirtuous about working very hard and making a great deal of money. However, the things that people do with that money, particularly if they've made it very quickly in very large amounts, are often very unvirtuous. But the thing is that in the end, nobody ever says no to it. His virtue did not preclude him getting his share.
No.
But I think since we're talking about the city, it's again in Wilbur's telling, you see how tents become huts, become houses. And then Sean and Duff and Candy are right at the centre of the building, of the construction of the key buildings.
Yeah, so there's a bit, this is before they've struck gold, where Wilbur describes it. So they're looking down the length of the valley. The week before, about 24 wagons had been outspanned around Candy's hotel, but now there are at least 200. And from where they sat, they could count another 8 or 9 encampments, some even larger than the one around Candy's place. Wood and iron buildings were beginning to replace the canvas tents, and the whole veldt was crisscrossed with rough roads along which mounted men and wagons moved without apparent purpose. So there you get this sort of first, sort of exactly as you described, sort of wood and iron buildings starting to replace the tents. And even that is just a very kind of quick stage of evolution to what's happening next.
Oh, and their own mine goes from being surface diggings. Then they find that there is a sort of stream of gold that runs through their property, and they dig down and they dig down and they dig down, and suddenly they're kind of 300 feet down, and they have their mine, the Candy Deep, and then they have another mine, the little sister mine, and then they think, oh, well, we need an office. We should have an office where we can organize all this. And the plan was for a modest little 4-room building, but it finally expanded to 2 stories, stinkwood floors, oak paneling, and 20 rooms. And then they find themselves buying great acres of land. Sean has at one point invested in a few wagons, and suddenly they have 400 wagons. And the speed of it, which in a kind of other story you'd think, any normal business story would think, oh, that's absurd. I suppose now it's not quite true because the internet barons have a similar sort of gold rush today, where you can make billions overnight.
Mm.
There's this incredible momentum which Wilbur's writing is perfectly suited to, where there's just the gold brings with it this sort of unstoppable energy and lust, expressed literally when they put up a whorehouse.
Yes.
So the 3 buildings they put up: the Stock Exchange, the hotel, and the brothel, known as the Opera House, initially put up to be an opera house until they decide, no, there's actually much better use for it. They start, for example, you get sort of domestication of the city, because water carts are brought in because the streets are only dust, but now they can have water carts in to water down the dust, so the dust doesn't get too bad.
Yeah, I mean, there's the great line, again, is a very deadpan, funny Wilbur line. With its own stock exchange and bordel, Johannesburg became a city. And I love that. It's such a Wilbur line. It's basically sex and money. Once you got those catered for, then you can be a city. And again, I think that's not far off the historical development of it.
And what you also get, though, is the development of, as it were, a ruling class.
Yeah.
This is in the first year. So they're bringing in people from all over Europe, the finest furniture, the finest wines. By December, there were millionaires in Johannesburg. And think of what I mean. That's like tens of millions now. Hradsky, that's the man who will be both Sean and Duff's partner and their nemesis. The Haynes brothers, Carl Lochtamper, Duff Charliewood, Sean Courtney, and a dozen others. They owned the mines, the land, the buildings in the city, the aristocracy of the Witwatersrand, knighted with money and crowned with gold. Thinking about it, it's odd that we live in an age now, or have just come probably, I think, to the end of an age, but certainly a 20-year period, where exactly the same process has taken place, where oligarchs in Russia, tech billionaires in California have suddenly, just at an enormous speed, become unimaginably wealthy and created, their private jets and their incredible mansions and their gigantic yachts. I mean, it's strange to be living in a time where what Wilbur's writing about is actually weirdly sort of applicable, because one sort of thinks, oh yes, we know these people now.
Yeah, and it does. That's why I think it's such an amazing setting for a novel, because as you say, when you read it, it almost strikes you as incredible that he's just pushing it too far, too fast. But then you look at the history, and really, really, he's not.
No,
And that's exactly how it happened.
because the thing about gold or diamonds is it's like Henry Ford has to set up a production line. Once you've got the stuff, you've got it. I mean,
Yeah,
you just sell what you've got because it's as valuable as it's ever going to be right there. And so once you've found the place in the earth where you can just keep extracting it, you're just basically taking a great big bucket down into the middle of the earth and extracting it filled with money every day. And yes, you have to crush down the rock and all the stuff with the mercury, but fundamentally, once you've struck your pay dirt, as long as it keeps paying, and as with if you're reading Leopard Rock, Wilbur's book, he describes how going down to gold mines in exactly that location now, which are now 2 miles underground,
yeah,
big, kind of enormous caverns and tunnels and roads and railways, 2 miles underground. The gold is still coming up.
yeah. I mean, the other thing that he captures very well in this book is sort of the highs and the lows, and the fact that everyone's, it's a combination of confidence, con tricks, hope, fear. The emotions of that, of being in that place. Talk about FOMO, fear of missing out, is absolutely driving everyone. And again, I think historically you see that there's a moment, I think about 1890, where they think the mines are all played out, and the shares absolutely collapse, and what workers are laid off, and it sort of echoes the way in which they Sean and Duff sort of put out that one of their mines has run out of gold, and that therefore it's going to be worthless, and they spread this rumor, and then they buy back the shares a week later, and make a killing on it, which of course ultimately will be their undoing when they try that on a grander scale.
Yes, I mean that's the thing. The thing about that kind of money is it can go as quickly as it comes.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, again, to use a modern analogy, there was a point in which Rupert Murdoch was paying a large amount of money for MySpace.
Yes, £700 million or something, wasn't it?
Yes, extraordinary. But now it's nothing.
Yeah.
And I sort of have a suspicion that Twitter could just disappear, or Facebook, because kids have moved on to something else. I mean, nowadays us oldies may use Facebook, but nobody under 30.
Yeah.
And right now it's TikTok, but it could be something. It was Snapchat. Does anybody still use Snapchat? That was great.
Yeah.
These things come and go very, very fast. And but meanwhile, the city is growing and growing. And the other thing, of course, that happens, and I'm sure this is absolutely typical, is that Duff and Sean build their kind of ridiculous, vastly oversized mansion, which is modestly christened Xanadu.
Yeah, which again, I have to think that Wilbur was kind of slightly tipping his hat to Citizen Kane here. I don't know if anyone ever asked him that, but he can't not have thought of that. And William Randolph Hearst, I guess, is that kind of great baron.
What he says is that Duff, is a great fan of the poem, and they actually have inscribed in Xanadu.
Yes, over the gates. Yeah,
Pleasure Dome, in any event, it's notionally it's because Duff is a fan of Coleridge, isn't it?
Yeah. And again, as a reader, you just get so swept up in it. I think there is just this tremendous sort of wish fulfillment about this idea that in the middle of the veldt, which 3 years earlier, whatever it is just been farmland. They've built this house which is outfitted with the finest of everything that can be got from around the world: furniture, artworks. The marble floors aren't there, and the whole thing is tricked out. And again, but this is true. And in the same way that you get prostitutes coming all the way from America because they've heard the business is good, you get whatever the chandeliers or pianos or fine wines or construction materials, they just they will go where the money is. So as extraordinary as it seems, that this place which you could only get to by ox cart a few years ago can have all this stuff, it does, because it finds its way to where the money is.
Is the chap who owns LVMH, the French luxury? What's it?
Is it Arnaud?
Yes, Arnaud.
Bernard Arnault?
Is he now kind of one of the richest, if not the richest?
I think he is. I think he's at the moment, at time of recording, he is the world's richest man. Yeah.
So and it's the same thing, because French luxury goods have gone to China and Singapore and Hong Kong because that's where the money is.
Yeah.
That's what happens. And because this is fiction, because Wilbur is to some extent a moral writer, there is a price to be paid for this. There is a comeuppance to be had.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a bit where he sort of describes how Sean's life is changing. So Sean and Duff grew with the city. Their way of life changed swiftly. Their visits to the mines fell to a weekly inspection, and they left it to their hired men. A steady river of gold poured down from the ridge to their offices on Eloff Street, for the men they hired were the best that money could find. Their horizons closed in to encompass only the 2-panelled offices, the Victoria Rooms, which is their suite, I think in the brothel.
No, it's the hotel, I think.
In the hotel, sorry, their suite in the hotel, yeah. Their horizons closed in to encompass only the 2-panelled offices, the Victoria Rooms, which is their suite in the hotel, and the Exchange. Yet within that world, Sean found a thrill that he had never dreamed existed. He had been oblivious to it during the first feverish months. He'd been so absorbed in laying the foundations that he could spare no energy for enjoying or even noticing it. The power is what he's feeling. He's feeling the sense of power, and it talks about how a document gets delivered to him, and it comes from the bank manager rather than from a clerk, even though there's no need for it. And he's become this big fish. And I think there's a very clear, I don't want to say morality, but order to the universe in Wilbur's work. And when your existence is being condensed down to just living indoors between a couple of locations, that's clearly a bad thing. Good is outdoors, rugged, hardworking, kind of earning your labor by the sweat of your brow. And living the sort of sybaritic lifestyle indoors is definitely the sign that you're on the road to ruin.
It's the inner Kruger in Wilbur.
Yes.
Spoiler alert: all this pride, all this hubris, leads to a fall. And I remember the first time that I read this book, and it would have been 35 years ago. One that would have been one of the very early ones I read of his. I didn't get into the 80s. I remember the first time I read this, and when Duff and Sean are, outsmarted, and they lose everything, I remember being really upset for them.
Yeah.
Funny enough, now with the benefit of far too many years of perhaps wisdom, experience, it didn't seem like nearly such a bad thing, because it kind of rescues them.
Yeah.
And so certainly Sean, although bad things are going to happen, is actually restored as a human being by losing all that status, all that wealth. And there's as he goes out afterwards into the country to go elephant hunting, there's this description of him getting leaner, getting fitter, his clothes again, and there's very much a sense that he was, in some respects, kind of dying inside in this kind of cocoon of wealth, and he needs to get out of it. But the city itself keeps growing.
Yeah, so he goes, as we discussed, he goes off across the frontier into the wilderness, shoots an awful lot of elephants, makes a second fortune, although he doesn't realize it, but he's got a fortune in ivory in his wagons. And then he comes back to Johannesburg. And that's a lovely moment because, as you say, he has changed in one direction and the city has gone on developing in its own direction. And it's a lovely contrast. I always think it's like, when you go back to your home, to the town where you grew up, and you realize how different you are. But in a sense, this is different too.
They've just come into the city, and it's doubled in size in the 4 years. And he thinks, and his friend Duff is by now dead, and he thinks he hears Duff's laugh. It was very close, but not the same. All of it was like that, similar but subtly changed, nostalgic but sad with the knowledge of loss. The past was lost, and he knew then that you can never go back. Nothing is the same, for reality can only exist at one time only, and in one place only. Then it dies, and you've lost it, and you must go on to find it at another time and in another place. And that's exactly as you say, that as it were, what was once your town isn't your town. It's somebody else's town. And you, the person you are, needs a new place to be that person.
Yes, and that's, I've had that experience a few times in my life because I grew up in America. And I lived for 10 years in a sort of suburban town just north of New York, and it was a wonderful, wonderful place, and I felt very much at home there. And I went, but then I left. I came back to the UK, and went back several years later. And you look around, and some of the shops have changed, and some of the shops are the same, and but it's just different, and you suddenly have this tremendous sense of not belonging. I get it when I go back to visit my old university as well, that you sort of look at the undergraduates there and it's their place now. And, you were there, it was yours, you walked around like you owned the place, and now you're gone and they don't care, and it's that same lesson that Wilbur's imparting here to Sean, as you say, that you can't find yesterday and today.
Yeah.
And which is a great part of Sean's evolution as a character.
Absolutely. And of course, by this point, Kruger has, it's in the book, has established control over the city to some degree.
Yeah.
So it is paying taxes, and they are, and the allocation of mining lots is determined now by Kruger, and he has dibs, as it were.
Yeah.
And it's gradually becoming the kind of, it's kind of like the town has been it's been a little kid, and then it's been this unruly adolescent.
Yeah.
And it's sort of got to the point where it's kind of married and is settling down, and sort of beginning its journey into comfortable middle age, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And of course, though we don't know at the end of where the land feeds where the road will lead, Sean Courtney has kind of a different destiny. That's not where, it's, as you say, it's not his place anymore, but then he's going to go and find other places to make his place.
Yeah. And I think in that respect, I think part of Wilbur's kind of greatness as a writer is he never really labors this metaphor. He just lets it happen. But in a sense, the whole of When the Lion Feeds is the kind of key moments of South African history which seed each other in the same way that Sean's every event in Sean's life leads on to the next. So the great event in part one of the book is the Zulu War, and historically it's by crushing the Zulus that the British, sort of the law of unintended consequence, they remove this tremendous threat to the Boers that the Boers have lived with for 30 odd years. And as a result, that's what emboldens the Boers to feel that they can declare independence and go it alone, because they don't need British protection anymore, because the British have kindly wiped out the biggest threat to them. And that's then what sort of sets the stage for, obviously, all the growth of Johannesburg and the Transvaal, where you get the gold rush. And of course, it's then all the pressures that are unleashed by the gold rush, and especially these outlanders coming in and agitating for more and more political rights, and of course the money that goes with it, that ultimately will become the causes of the Boer War. and which, of course, is where Sean Courtney is going to end up next in the sequel.
Though neither Wilbur nor the reader knows that at the time.
No, Wilbur, as we said, Wilbur has no idea that there's going to be a sequel. He thinks this is a one and done, a standalone, as we would call it now.
Extraordinary. I know we've talked about this before, but if ever there was a book that was screaming for a sequel, and usually, if you're writing a book that you well, I suppose this is why it proves he didn't know, because if you're writing a book that you know is going to have a sequel, there's usually a little line at the end, which kind of is a sort of payoff, which lets the reader know, sort of, to be continued.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, I mean, I know there's Tomorrow is Another Day at the end of Gone with the Wind. There's that Tomorrow is Another Day, and that actually you expect a sequel, and I don't think there was one. At least not.
There was one of these written in the 80s or maybe early 90s ones, but not by Margaret Mitchell.
No. In this particular case, as a reader, you just kind of want to know what happens next, now I think about it, not just for Sean, but for the whole world that you've seen being born. Because that as a reader is a tremendously exciting thing, because you do feel you're there watching this thing just explode, and it's terribly thrilling. And going back to the point about accuracy, that's what historians are for. I was once writing a book called Ostland, which is about World War II, and particularly has a lot set in Minsk, which became a killing centre of Jews who were brought up from Theresienstadt, taken off the trains and slaughtered. It's just unutterably horrible. And I had a very kind historian called Roger Morehouse was kind of acting as my sort of supervisor and sort of correcting me on stuff. And I sent him a draft and I said, is this okay? Is this okay? And he said, yeah. He said, the history's fine, but you leave that to people like me. And that was a tremendously liberating thing for me. It was like giving you permission. Now, of course, with something like that, you owe it to the victims to be incredibly respectful and incredibly accurate.
Yeah.
But in the case of something like Joburg, there isn't that same moral duty. Your duty is to your reader. And that's what Wilbur serves, because he makes this story, which could be, you can imagine an economist giving quite a dry as dust account.
Yeah.
He makes it tremendously exciting. You're absolutely there. You're caught up in the thrill of the gold and the sex and the boozing and the building the mansions and the horse racing, all of that stuff. And yet at the same time you are, and this I think is true, I learned a huge amount about African history by reading Wilbur Smith books. Maybe I didn't learn it in the same, and maybe a historian will be rather shocked by the things like that, but you learn about the spirit of the place. He really tells you about the peoples who are interacting. Right from, if you go back to the very early Courtney book, Birds of Prey, you learn about the Hottentot, who are the original inhabitants. And then you see all the other tribes, the white tribes, the African tribes, all converging, particularly on southern Africa from the north and the south. And you see how they interact. And he does teach you. And if you want to know the facts, then you can then go and look at a history book. But I think you learn a tremendous amount whilst being outrageously entertained.
Yeah, that outrageously entertained is the way of putting it. I think probably the best way I've found of understanding South African history is that it is a constant struggle between these different groups, and particularly the Afrikaners, the British, and the sort of the Black African tribes. But that's a gross oversimplification, because there are many Black African tribes who have different and diverging interests and hostilities, and all these different groups of people trying to find ways of coexisting, and frequently failing. And that's what Wilbur's dramatizing. Again, that's what the Courtneys are living as they go out in the world and try and make their fortunes. And I think that's the stories would have plenty of power all by themselves, because the characters are so strong and the action is so dramatic, but it just marries so perfectly with the underlying history and the drama of that history. And as you say, not every date is going to be accurate, not every historical personage is going to be accurate, but the fundamental truth of it absolutely is right there.
So that wraps up our deep deep dive into When the Lion Feeds, Wilbur Smith's first novel.
And do join us next time when we'll be discussing the latest Wilbur Smith book, co-authored with me, Tom Harper, which came out in April, Nemesis.
So please join me, Diana Thomas,
and me, Tom Harper,
for the next edition of That Wilbur Smith Show. That Wilbur Smith Show is produced by Christopher Wynne.
Music by Dewey DeLay.